Before we do, though, I want to touch on this one. Serena has asked a quick question about St Pauli, which we probably do have to touch on. They lost again this weekend.
Yeah.
She asked what is going wrong at St Pauli. We touched on it last episode. Obviously, for anyone who's not paying attention, St Pauli lost against Gladbach at the weekend there 4-0, which is significant for two reasons, because the first one is that Gladbach are absolutely pants at this moment in time, which is a significant win for them and for Polanski, obviously, as the interim head coach, is looking to kind of keep that job. But it's now the sixth successive Bundesliga defeat for them. Manu, it's an interesting question because obviously they are kind of in free fall at the moment, but there's also something quite funny happened in the post-match press conference when the St Pauli head coach walked in. Blessin, sorry, I forgot his name there. He sat down to answer questions and the power turned off. Then flicked back on a few moments later, but he was, football is all about like the kind of omens and, all these things, and he was like, oh God, that doesn't really help. Sure enough, I was reading the Kicker kind of opinion piece on what's going wrong at St Pauli, and that was the top line, oh gosh, how can Blessin turn the lights back on for St Pauli,
Oh my God.
And unfortunately, that is the kind of cliches that we sports writers trade in. So we can't really help it. But yeah, St. Pauli, absolute mess. What's gone wrong? I've got a few opinions on this, but I'll let you jump in if you want to go first.
Well, there's a few things going on, right? Like the whole Jackson Irvine thing off the pitch, the controversy surrounding him. Goes back to him wearing a pro-Palestine shirt and the St. Pauli fan base. Obviously, it's a complicated topic. I don't want to dive too deep into it, but a big part of St. Pauli fan base, because of Germany's past, felt that was complicated. I think that is something that is really hurting the club because Irvine is such an important player for them, and a leader off the pitch and on the pitch. And I think there's also things like with his wife and his fan base. Like the fan base wasn't happy that she was modeling some stuff for I think it's her clothing line, using like the stadium and the St. Pauli like kind of like as a backdrop, and they felt used, and little things like that. Like if you are a team that needs to punch above its weight to be successful, like those little things, these frictions can really hurt you. And then there's also a lot of criticism at the moment towards Blessin and his match selection and the squad selection, the way that he's trying to play a certain style of football. There's a lot of people within fans, within the fan groups, that believe that maybe he doesn't have the right personnel to play the football that he wants to play. This progressive type of football that got him the job in the first place, because like he replaced Fabian Hürzeler, right? So I think there's a couple like these underlying currents that are going on, and if your club is a little bit in turmoil, then where everything went right last year, it's kind of going off a little bit. Having said all of that, they didn't have the best start last year either, and kind of had to work their way into the season. So this could also just be a matter of like, they always have a big turnover in players. He's trying to work new players into the squad. They're not in a relegation spot despite everything. That's because there's so many other teams that have been more crap, including Gladbach, who beat them comprehensively in this match day, and that is a concern. But I think when it comes to all of these things, they have to kind of control what's going on off the pitch. And Blessin has to be able to like install the system he wants to play. And if that kind of leads to friction, that can be something that then you start doubting yourself, you start rotating, and then of course the results get even worse.
Yeah, well, it's actually an interesting point you raised there about how they did last season. Obviously, that was Blessin taking over for a head coach who he replaced and had to kind of really grab the reins around a squad that he inherited, and then try to play a certain way. And, I was at the Hamburg derby at the start of the season, and I watched St. Pauli play Haasfall off the pitch, and I wrote after the game, I thought, oh, this is the kind of St. Pauli 2.0. First season, Blessin kind of has to kind of put out fires, do the basics properly, avoid relegation, but now we're going to see Blessin play the football that he wants to play. And that hasn't really happened, obviously, because they've kind of had some real struggles there. But I think the kind of issue, and to a large extent, is in what has kind of proved to be the long-term issues that have kind of still crept into the squad, is that he's ultimately having to rebuild all over again because the players they've lost in the summer, and they've lost so many big players. Philip Trieu, the right back, obviously left for Freiburg, who was a huge player for them. I wrote in the summer that, a really great signing for Freiburg. Morgan Giavogi, top goal scorer, heads back to Ligue 1. Elias Sad moves to Augsburg. Johannes Eggestein, who I know maybe not the biggest player, but a really important player, heads to Austria. That's 3 of the top 5 players for goals and assists last season. The other one is Jackson Irvine, who, as you said, having big issue with the fan base, members of the board kind of coming out publicly criticising him, not to mention the fact that he's had to deal with injuries as well, which he's only just kind of returning from, but he was probably one of their best playmakers, if you want to kind of put it that way, last season. And fundamentally, I do think for St Pauli and Blessin, that attack just isn't really working. We saw that in this game where Blessin pulled off the front 3 at half-time. Players he brings on didn't really quite work out, but, we're talking about guys like Untonji, who was kind of brought in, who I thought actually had a really good game against Haas Fall, if I'm not mistaken, but it hasn't really quite worked out for him. I'm just kind of looking at the players that have come in and out of that team, and there's a lot of kind of back and forth. There's a lot of injuries. There's a lot of players benched. Blessin isn't happy with that. And I think also what's interesting is that if you kind of look through what Blessin's been saying in press conferences, and I think you can maybe question whether it's the smartest thing to do, to be honest with you, but he has been quite outspoken about the players who aren't performing for him. He's saying things like some players aren't used to closing down and gegenpressing and tracking like the way that they should be doing, which is maybe not an entirely subtle dig at the players that have been brought in. And it kind of feels like maybe there's a lot of frustration from Blessin about the squad that he has to work with right now, to the point that it's kind of bubbling over into the surface. And then you add the whole thing with Jackson Irvine in that as well. And it feels like there's quite a lot of tension between the playing squads and either the manager or the club itself. And not to mention, this is a club that's already incredibly passionate to begin with, So I guess we'll just have to see, Manu, whether they can fix all that this season before anything kind of drastic happens. Because as you said, despite the fact that they've lost 6 games already this season, they're still not in the bottom 3, which is absolutely mental. Heidenheim, Mainz, and Gladbach are obviously below them, but we have to kind of wait and see whether Gladbach can get their own shit together, which, despite winning this game, I'm still not entirely convinced by. I think I said on last week's show, the week before, it feels to be like Heidenheim have kind of ran their race in the Bundesliga. Frank Schmidt's maybe kind of running out of ideas, which, by the way, itself was already a kind of like incredible story. And, we can't expect Heidenheim just to stay in the Bundesliga forevermore. And of course, Mainz, who have been struggling as well, who we did have a question about how Mainz are doing as well. And, they're just trying to adapt to life without Burkhardt and a number of other issues as well. So I think maybe we're seeing a lot of kind of maybe question marks, and the club have kind of, I don't know if they said officially or maybe unofficially, the reporter is that Blessin's still safe in his position. There's obviously going to be a lot of tension there if clubs like Gladbach, Mainz, Heidenheim, Augsburg do kind of turn things around. But as things stand, Haasfeld obviously lost as well today, which means they've only got 1 win in 5. There's a lot of clubs down there that could definitely get relegated. And as things stand, St Pauli are still kind of okay. And amongst all those clubs there, they're one of the few clubs who have kind of gone through this already with Blessin. So you'd think they would give him the kind of time and patience to kind of make sure he can kind of turn things around again this season.
Yeah, you would think so. I mean, I also remember they actually paid quite a lot of money to get him too. For their standards. And at the same time too, if you St Pauli, they're like one of those top 20 clubs, 25 clubs in German football. That does mean that every once in a while you have to also go down. It's just, size of club that you are. Unless you like try to emulate what Union Berlin have maybe done in Berlin. But I think that's hard, especially with HSV now being back in the Bundesliga.